over at RotoViz. We are recording this Friday morning, January 3rd. There are some games January 4th, January 5th. Over the weekend, the Week 18 games that have not yet been played as we record this. We are obviously also going to spend a lot of the offseason talking about 2024 and what it means for 2025. And yeah, this idea of recapping the entire 2024 season in one show is a little bit optimistic. But it's a fun place to start. It's a good conversation point. I'm definitely selling it as well as possible right now. Shawn, how you doing? You finished up the season very strong. Finished it with a team in the top 100 in the main event on FFPC. Won several dynasty leagues over at FFPC. Yeah, we just finished up week 17. We haven't recorded since finishing up week 17, so we got to acknowledge all the great finishes as well. How you doing?
Good. This it was a fun week to sit back, decompress a little bit. We're excited about the big FFPC playoff contest next week. We'll have lots of content for you on that as we roll a little closer. Dan Campbell, my favorite coach. Love to see what the Lions did on Monday Night Football. Had a big impact on the dynasty results as those teams also did extremely well. The team that you and I had did go down in week 15, but we were excited. We have 3 first-round picks next year. One of those is obviously ours, but one of the other ones, that manager did win the back draw, which in the FFPC means that becomes the 101. That's going to be a lot of fun doing that team with you as we go forward. Really, the Tua and Derek Carr injuries during the course of the season made it tough to get into the position we needed to be in, but mostly we didn't score in week 15. So that's a week you have to get through.
Yeah, don't have a lot of QB love there. Those are our QBs, Tua and Derek Carr, and they both got hurt. I think we were playing Andy Dalton at a point in season. So getting the 101 is pretty nice because I know it's not supposed to be a great QB class, but we can hopefully address the QB position. But yeah, great season. You had a lot of successes. We had a lot of success in the regular season in our main event teams together, and in the divisional playoffs that go weeks 13 and 14. We talked about those at the time. Certainly a successful year overall. It was an exciting year from the perspective of looking at rookies, especially, for example. I mean, Jaden Daniels had one of the most impressive rookie seasons of all time. And a lot of people are saying that he doesn't deserve Rookie of the Year because Brock Bowers broke all the rookie records. I mean, he set the all-time receptions record, not just for a tight end, but for any rookie. Broke Puka Nakua's record and still has another game. Broke Mike Ditka's 50-year-old rookie receiving yards record for a tight end. Broke all those records. Obviously, a guy that you had on basically all of your teams all offseason, Brock Bowers. I remember talking right after the draft when you had him over, I think when the Underdog drafts opened up, you had him like in the 60s and he was going in like the hundreds, and it was like, okay, you're 50 spots ahead of him in ADP. Like how early are you going to get him in every draft? Apparently that wasn't high enough, Shawn. Should have had him even higher. Can't believe you were so low on him. But yeah, no.
Well, Ben, that reminds me of another little fun note. We enjoy every season playing in Mike Clay's Going Deep League that includes a lot of the best minds and cool people in the industry. And we were able to win that for the third time since 2017. I was kind of looking back through the history to make sure that was correct. Those 8 seasons that are listed there on MFL, this was the third title, and that team obviously did benefit from having Jaden Daniels and Brock Bowers.
Yeah, and we talked to Mike Clay on the show a couple years ago. Some of the long-term listeners might remember us talking about this format and having Mike Clay on when we used to do guests more frequently or at all. We haven't discussed in a long time. But we talked to him about, our strategy at the time was this is a format. It's called going deep, where there's a lot um, it's a deep format. There's a lot of a large percentage of your roster goes into your starting lineup, I should say. It's not the deepest team necessarily. I think it's 18-man rosters, but it's like 13-man starting lineups. So you start, it's super flex, and assuming you start 2 QBs, you then start 3 running backs, 6 receivers, and 2 tight ends, and it's tight end premium. And so, yeah, I mean, 6 receivers and 2 tight ends and all of that. There's, it's a 12-team league. There's constraints. You're starting guys in the championship. We started Jalen Tolbert, who we just had added, and we're able to take that down. But yeah, we talked to him a couple of years ago about how our strategy did kind of revolve around the quarterback position and the tight end position, really, that you want to be able to squeeze the beast a little bit at tight end. We took Dalton Kincaid in this league as well, Sean. We took Breece Hall in the first round. Doesn't have a great year. We took Kincaid in the third, but we really wanted to hammer tight end. So we took Kittle in the fourth, and we also still took Bowers in the seventh when he slid a little. So we had 3 tight ends in our first 7 picks. You can only start 2.
We
But
were
when
trying to
Kincaid,
let someone else have him. We were trying to show a little bit of restraint because we had him so many places. But in round 7, we're like,
yeah,
no, there's no way. I mean, it's going to be
you
rough
wanted to
hours.
take him in 6, and I was like, I think there's a chance he'll come back, and we've already taken 2 tight ends. So in 6, I convinced you that we should take Stephon Diggs and get our receiver room kicked off. That obviously wasn't very helpful either to our build, but despite some of these picks not really working out, the Bowers Kittle combo, the Jaden Daniels, and then we took Bo Nix, and we also got Drake May really late, but it was mostly Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix, Bowers and Kittle. We had JSN, we had Lad McConkey, we had Jerry Jeudy, had some nice wide receiver depth picks. We had Bucky Irving in the late rounds. So
But
certainly
again,
some
you can
other
see
good.
how much difference the rookies made. I mean, you're talking about Daniels, Nix, Bowers, and Irving being the guys who really differentiated us from other teams that were also strong.
That's right. I mean, very fun format though for anyone who hasn't considered that or is looking for some spice in their league or those types of things. I always like talking about this format because we believe, I think I could speak for you too, Sean. I know I certainly believe that fantasy football should be played in deeper formats, a lot more fun. We were talking about the FFPC Dynasty leagues a moment ago. Those RotoViz Triflex leagues are awesome, where you get 3 receivers plus 2 flexes, plus a super flex. You can wind up playing, if you're not super flexing a QB, you can wind up playing like 6 receivers in those formats as well. You can play up to like 4 tight ends. Depending on how you manage all the flexes and everything. I love those formats that are deeper. I think that's the way fantasy football was meant to be played, but most casual people don't necessarily like to. You get into home leagues, they don't want to expand it because they don't want to have to necessarily worry about things too much. But that's one of the things I love about and people always talk about the waivers get so shallow. One of the things I love about Mike Clay's format here, it's still only 18-man rosters. I mean, there are no kickers and Ds. And so for an 18-man non-kicker D league, it does get pretty thin. But with super
But it's fun to
flex,
be able to pick up players who, I mean, almost every week, because the starting lineups are so deep and the benches are so shallow, you either can or are forced to pick someone up off of waivers and immediately insert them into the starting
and then
lineup.
put them in your lineup. Right. That's exactly right. That's the fun part of it. I really like the way that's set up. The shallow benches is a thing that ends up being really cool, where there's a lot of. Anyway, would recommend it to anybody who is looking for a little bit of a different approach and wants a little bit more movement, player movement. Like you said, you have to make tough cuts too. One of the things I love about it as well is he has the IR spot. So if you do get injured players, you can stash them on IR, then add somebody and start them. And those IR spots extend to even just being ruled out. So if it's Sunday morning and your player gets ruled out, you can put them on your IR, add somebody, and start them right away. So there's some little quirks like that help you navigate the very narrow benches. You're not put into these tough binds where you're having to cut players just because they're like out for a week or else take a 0. But yeah, for anyone who's looking for a little bit of a shakeup or those types of things, definitely recommend formats that have shallow benches, deep starting lineups. I think that's a really cool way to still like leave some talent on the waiver wire, like you're saying, where we can add guys and actually play them. They're actually viable. Even in a super flex format, I mean, you're able to find some QBs at times because with the shallow benches, people aren't holding a third quarterback necessarily.
Well, not holding the backups for sure.
Yeah,
And so
for
when people
sure.
go down, new quarterbacks do become relevant.
Right. That's another cool thing. Superflex with shallow benches leads to a little bit more quarterback liquidity, which is, always a big thing in Superflex. Anyway, that's a fun format. We took it down. That was great. 2024, Shawn, the rookies. Yeah, I was talking through obviously the quarterbacks, tight ends. You got we just mentioned a couple of the running backs, receivers. One of the big things that I was harping on this offseason was that I felt like there was going to be a lot of late round running back scoring this year. There wasn't as much, but one of the big things I was saying was the rookie running backs were something to hammer in all formats. It was nice to see, Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy kind of be key parts of that. That obviously wasn't the story of 2024. In another year, I look at those guys and I'm like, in another year, they would have been even bigger hits, because it was a little trickier this year for those late round big seasons to pay off when the early round running backs stayed so healthy and were so productive. But yeah, the rookie receivers were great this year too. Neighbors and Brian Thomas and we mentioned Ladd, and Xavier Worthy came up solidly for people who had him in the fantasy playoffs. Obviously tough year for him, but rookies were big this year, Shawn. Definitely something that we've talked about over the years. As far as, both dynasty and redraft as a way to build and a foundational element of, look, like even in dynasty, you're not taking rookies just to rebuild or for a long-term thing. You're taking them to potentially win now. That was, I think, a big story in 2024.
It was. And I think with that, some of these mildly disappointing players are going to be big in year two. That was something we mentioned a bit with Worthy as it relates to guys who blew up this season, like a Jackson Smith and Jigba, a Jordan Addison, even arguably, someone who disappointed a little bit, like a Jaden Reed, where you have that second year potential. You probably have a better floor than people are really giving credit for. And then you have this immense season, certainly for some of these guys too, on a weekly basis. You have an interesting ceiling there. The sort of overreaction to, or maybe not even overreaction, but the extreme reaction to big seasons, and then what that means for the guys who were good but not great, especially younger players, and how it can then be difficult for the highest drafted guys to really come through, whereas that next sort of disappointing tier, you potentially have a lot of league winners. Then I think that is one of the big takeaways for me, especially if you're entering a new environment where perhaps more running backs are going to be relevant. Certainly, for me, for a long, long time, one of the things that I do love about the FFPC is the tight end premium and the chance to do things that are maybe a little bit more unique. But thinking through this idea of how do we dominate the flex across different types of years, the tight end position, always so important. And we did a full show on this kind of at midseason and discussing, language, labels, are the elite tight ends only the first ones who go, the ones who are so expensive that they're pushing you off of other important guys? Does that essentially extend down into the range where anybody that you think is going to be a league winner, technically still counts as an elite tight end? I don't know that part of it is as important as simply looking at the tight ends and trying to figure out how you can both dominate that position and potentially dominate a flex position. True in both dynasty, where in so many of these dynasty teams, one of the reasons that it was this magical dynasty season was that if you have Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, and Brock Bowers, two of those three guys, in some cases all three of those guys, not only is it going to be difficult for anybody to match you at tight end, even with someone like a Jonnu Smith out there, but you then have additional options at the flex position. In many cases, you can play those players in the super flex spot, but you think to redraft and you think about the way that Kittle and Bowers and McBride scored, the vast majority of our main event teams were centered around that trio, and that trio was very definitive. And again, not just for the tight end spot, but for having this ability to not just play someone in the flex, but dominate the flex. I mean, you go out and you think about Brock Bowers in his relatively disappointing week 17 game, and yet it's still a game that is almost impossible for a different type of player to match without really going off. You want to think about how easy it is for your star to get to a certain number of points. Bauer's ability to get to a big number versus, say, Saquon Barkley's ability to get to a big number. I mean, they're skewed in very different directions. If you have multiple stars, you want to be thinking in terms of how easy is it for them to get to the scoring numbers that you want without having to do things that are extraordinary, like breaking off multiple 40 to 50 to 60 yard touchdown runs.
That's right. And I mean, that's a really key point about the whole elite tight end thing. I mean, that's something that I'm going to do a lot of writing about this offseason, talking about, self-reflecting on. It's a big reason my personal results weren't where I wanted them to be, despite some really strong player evaluation and selection overall, was sort of the structural side of it. One of the big differences, I think, Shawn, between our like individual personal portfolios is, I know you were saying to me a decent amount in the summer, like, you do got to take some of these really running backs. And I really wanted to get the elite tight ends basically into every type of build. And I think there's a real structural lesson there and conversation there, because it was still about, look, you need to have access to the same types of wide receivers, even though there were some big, receiver injuries and they weren't quite as dominant. The very good ones were at the very top, or they were the rookie breakouts, like a Brian Thomas, who ended up being the top scoring wide receiver in the fantasy playoffs from weeks 15 to 17. But right behind him, you have T. Higgins, actually, with the monster game, is second, but you have Mike Evans, Amon-Ra, you have Neighbors, who was a really high ADP guy, Jefferson, Jamar Chase a little ways further down, but obviously had the massive game just before the fantasy playoffs in, what was it, in week 14, the absolutely ridiculous game. But over at tight, so you still obviously you needed exposure to those tight wide receivers. You don't have any wide receivers scoring late or really over the whole course of the season that are super late round guys. I mean, you had some individual weeks that popped up for the best ball people. Like Ricky Pearsall's week 17 ended up being really exciting, and ended up playing a big factor for some of those teams, and like Adam Thielen popping up and those things. But people weren't starting those guys in regular leagues, and so you do think through that element of it. The elite tight end conversation is so interesting because as I'm looking at the fantasy playoff scoring and the way that finished up, you have Trey McBride as the top scoring tight end, Sam Laporta. This is just regular PPR. Trey McBride, Sam Laporta was second. George Kittle. You do have Jonnu Smith there in fourth. Brock Bowers is fifth. You have Chig Okonkwo in sixth. And so Jonnu and Okonkwo are the two later round tight ends that popped up there. And you have Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce in seventh and eighth. So you actually have 5 of those 7 elite tight ends wound up being in the top 8 in fantasy playoff scoring. And that was part of the conversation with elite tight ends, is what you were saying, is like how these guys are used. They can be the focal points of their offense, and it's tough to match that scoring with just anybody. It's even if there are, I think, pretty clear busts in the cases of guys like Kelce or Andrews, they still have the potential to score and be used enough in the postseason. In Andrews' case, he has 3 touchdowns. In Kelce's case, he has 26 targets, which is right up there with the very top of the position. It looks like McBride led the position with 30 targets over those 3 weeks. So Kelce just 4 behind him. I mean, the ways that these guys are going to be focal points of their offense, or at least utilized in certain ways. For Andrews, he hasn't been a focal point, but he's been a red zone focal point. He scored a bunch of touchdowns this year. Gets back to why we were drafting him that high in the first place, the talents that they are. And even when they're not scoring well, it is a range of outcomes type thought that, they are still able to put up scores that are very usable or can be very meaningful. And so anyway, that whole tight end conversation and as you're thinking about sort of structurally and building teams in the future and what the answers are. What do we do about early running backs in the future? How does ADP shift? I mean, those are the important thoughts, and trying to place them. Like as I sit here and talk about the elite tight ends, and I say that look, 5 of them scored in the top 8 in the fantasy playoffs. That's a fact. But I'm also sitting here thinking, I'm certain that there's a lot of, I've talked before about this sort of like vibes based fantasy analysis that has become more popular. I feel like I sound like a boomer here. I feel like it's the next generation that's the problem, right? It's all the Zoomers' fault. But I can like almost hear like the social media mocking of like, oh my God, they're trying to push elite tight end on you again, because there is this corner of the fantasy space that has already decided that elite tight end completely failed. And because it completely failed, anyone who's trying to say that there are merits to it or there's reasons to consider it in 2025 has their head in the sand. And that's just not the way that you should approach things over multiple seasons. We talked about this, Sean, quote that you put into one of my articles as you were editing it years and years and years ago, but the fantasy managers always overlearn the lessons from the year prior. It's my favorite like fantasy quote. And again, it was one little sentence that you dropped into help my a conclusion of a long piece that I wrote years ago at RotoViz, and then somebody shared on Twitter how they really liked this piece and especially this one quote. And I was like, that's awesome that you picked out that one quote that I didn't even write. That Sean helped with the conclusion as he was editing it. But yeah, that sentiment is something we've talked about on Stealing Bananas year after year after year, that the market overlearns the lessons from the prior year, and that is going to be strong this year. And it's not going to necessarily be easy to navigate. It's never easy to navigate. But for example, with the elite tight end thing and the point that I was making, I could very much because the vibes based point on elite tight end is that it failed and it was wrong, and therefore you get to it's somehow flawed. And I don't think it's flawed is the point that I'm saying, is what you were just saying. And as we go forward and ADP is different and Brock Bowers and Trey McBride are undoubtedly the tight end 1 and tight end 2 going into next year, I mean, do you really want to fade those guys because elite tight end was supposedly flawed in 2024? I mean, again, I'm not trying to argue that elite tight end worked in 2024, but I'm trying to make good decisions for 2025. And that's the important way to think through, where we go from here.
It'll be really interesting, I think, at the tight end position, because you are going to see those guys at the top. And it does seem like this year's approach will probably not be as successful. And when I say this year's approach, one of the things that you and I did successfully in our FFPC drafts in August and September was to target this trio of players who both had immense upside, but also were favorably priced. And when I wrote sort of my 2024 draft blueprint that focused on what I called the upside mega tiers and was working through how you would incorporate the different positions, one of the things that I felt was incredibly important for this season, but certainly is always the case, is that you want to figure out where the exploitable opportunities are based on your analysis, and then you have to attack those, right? I don't think that you can simply look at ADP and say that this is likely to be correct in the big picture. Because one of the things that you could see at tight end, or that potentially was there, was that you had a flatter group than what ADP indicated. And so one of the things I think that we tried to do as well was to, target some different players within that group. We did like Dalton Kincaid. That was a huge bust. But as you're kind of working through it, you look at a Sam Laporta, and you can make the claim that in some ways, Brock Bowers in 2025 will be Sam Laporta from 2024.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that that pattern match is probably going to send you down the wrong path. One of the reasons that we generally didn't have any Sam Laporta was because of the congestion in that offense and the ability to potentially replicate the scoring from other cheaper players. There are worlds in which Brock Bowers wasn't. Well, I mean, I don't think Brock Bowers himself probably has too many universes where he wasn't this kind of prospect, but certainly people who come in with elite profiles don't always hit the way Brock Bowers did. And certainly people who drafted a lot of Marvin Harrison are like, yeah, I mean, we just saw that with Marvin Harrison. So it's not a guarantee that you were going to be able to access scoring like that later. But when you had a Trey McBride, who was, granted only marginally cheaper, but in a better type of situation, when you have a George Kittle, who, I mean, he was the most undervalued player in terms of it being so clear cut that he was undervalued. We had all of this information about what he had done in the past, and then contextually, there were also clues that he was going. I mean, it was a bizarre undervaluing. When you have that, you have to make sure that you're getting exposure to that, in part because it's cheaper than doing it the same way, right? I mean, you have to find these opportunities to take the cheaper player, and then you have Brower. So you have three guys at different price levels who could potentially do what you need for you. There's absolutely no guarantee that 2025 will offer that. We don't yet know what ADP is going to be. Certainly, we've got the whole draft process to go through. We know, I mean, one of the things that I said did matter to me, and that we didn't necessarily have enough, total data to make the case in a strong way. But certainly circumstantially, you could say, why are Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors so expensive when we're coming off of recent seasons from Kyle Pitts and Sam Laporta that suggest the tight end position is very similar to wide receiver in terms of the superstar prospects contributing right away? I don't think that if we have players like that going forward, you're going to get that same discount, because Bowers, even if again it doesn't actually add that much to the sample, it's such a monster season.
Well, and
Young
Bowers,
tight end prospects are not going to be that cheap again. So you're just simply not going to have those same opportunities.
yeah, the Bowers one is so fascinating because God, you can talk about that from so many different levels, but it's a Kyle Pitts had the 1,000-yard season a couple years ago. Laporta had the 10 TDs last year. We started to talk about, well, rookie tight ends might be able to score. We've talked so many times about how, I mean, that was one of the big things with rookie tight ends in general, and wanting to play them the last couple of years, was that you had to do it in the face of these long-term trends that rookie tight ends don't actually score, right? And those are the long-term trends, and those are going to be the long-term trends until they're not anymore. And that's a whole different conversation about fantasy, but it's one of these things where we have generally accepted things. It's all very small sample, and the league is evolving. And you're talking about how with Pitts and Laporta, we had seen very recently that the league had evolved enough that the conditions were different than the data that suggested that rookie tight ends can't score. That there was enough of an adjustment over the last decade, but people want to cling to data. And so Bowers is just a great example, what I'm struggling to say here, of the way that the fantasy industry, or football more broadly, has a trend or some type of analysis that becomes very strongly accepted in the groupthink and in the the greater dogma, or what have you, and we're basically told that you can't dispute it. And it gets back to these ideas of like nothing has happened, or something hasn't happened up until the point that it has happened, and and those types of things. Anyway, Bowers has so clearly, I think, destroyed this narrative that going forward, the rookie tight ends can't score thing, you're not going to hear that nearly as much, obviously. I mean, just simply because of Bowers being as dominant as he was, but he's just this great example. I mean, setting aside what I'm trying to set aside is this specific rookie tight end thing, and more talk about the ways that we talk about trends and these types of things that can't happen. I mean, like for example, Sean, the other big trend was how much, and people would dispute this, but how much of a requirement QB mobility is to having high ADPs. And we were willing to make bets on CJ Stroud this year. We've talked recently about that being one of the most bizarre storylines of 2024. One of the hardest things to understand is sort of his regression. But we were willing to draft him at a high ADP. And you'll hear people respond to that and just say, well, this is what we tried to tell you. You shouldn't have taken CJ Stroud this high because he's immobile. We knew he was immobile when we were willing to take him there. Is sort of my point. We were trying to go against something that is a generally accepted trend because of the possibility that something different might actually happen, that he might be so uniquely gifted as a passer. Now that I'm trying to give a second type of an example of a situation where it didn't work out, but it was still worth considering alternate realities to what we have seen in past trends and those types of things. Anyway, the Brock Bowers thing is so fascinating.
The Stroud one, Ben, if I can jump in for a moment, is interesting to me because I do think that it pairs up a little bit with the Marvin Harrison ADP, which in many ways is completely and totally different. But Marvin Harrison is drafted really early because he's this elite prospect, and young receivers have done well recently. The problem with that for me was simply, and a tiny little bit of it was that I did feel like there were some mild red flags on his profile that weren't knocking him into a range that was fair, like just the middle of the third, say. But mostly it's this idea that, yeah, there's the ceiling, but as we're drafting early, you need to have the ceiling and the floor. Whereas the way to exploit the rookie receiver trends is to go after the guys like Worthy and McConkey and Thomas. And I would say that I didn't draft nearly enough McConkey or Thomas. That's pretty straightforward. Looking back at it, you have to figure out and work through. And this is, again, the idea of the mega tiers, but also the idea of how we even look at addressing individual teams is how can you replicate production and a profile less expensively, and at any point in the draft you want to be taking the thing that you can't replicate later. And so for Stroud, the thesis that we were working with was one where we're trying to replicate the upside of a Patrick Mahomes later
really
in the
what
draft.
Joe Burrow gave us this year, if you want a good example.
Exactly. And so it's interesting because as you work through and you drop down, you're thinking, okay, I'm adding risk as I go through it. For me, one of the more interesting things as I was looking at the sort of week 15 meltdown on a few of our teams and contrasting that with week 15 being specifically the biggest week for some of the elite QBs, and then other guys sort of overcome them in week 16 and 17. But you want to be aware of not having your own teams and your own experiences play too large of a role. And obviously for us, one of the things that we've joked about on the show, but continued to be a real sort of both headache and heartbreak, was to have put together this team that was so good and that had CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Tua Tagovailoa, and Drake May. And you're thinking of those four options, either A, we can stream it, or B, one of them will do what we need. And the fact of the matter was that
Week 17,
even as you get down to week 17, 2 of them are out and 2 of them are terrible, just unbelievably bad.
We
and
spent a lot of time on the show in the last month talking about that 4 QB team, and 2 of them missed and 2 of them were bad.
But the QB thing, and again, this is always going to be influenced by who actually hits. And you only know that after the fact. If Stroud had even had a decent season, there wouldn't be nearly as much emphasis or nearly as much regret. But, and the sort of weird thing in our specific leagues is that I ended up with so much of him because he kept falling way below ADP in my leagues. And I talk all the time about not getting trapped by trying to get ADP values and to target your own guys. There is another little thing of just having enough humility to maybe not even take ADP values on your own guys. Certainly in a main event portfolio, you might consider that, but the thesis was more or less correct. But Jared Goff was the highest scoring QB in the fantasy playoffs. And as you always like to point out to me, like he can barely take a step forward. He'll sometimes be running into an area where there are like 50 yards ahead of him with no players, and he will gain 3 yards on the play.
He ran for 9 yards in the fantasy playoffs across 3 weeks.
So you have Jared Goff, you have Baker Mayfield, you have Joe Burrow. You want to replicate that production even less expensively. And, again, to have the humility to perhaps take multiple guys. But we did have the humility on some of these teams to take multiple guys, and none of them hit. So it will be interesting, I think, to work through 2025. I think I'm probably going to be more open to spending occasionally on elite quarterbacks, which is something I've never liked to do because I really like to get the most total value. I want to be able to withstand injuries. One of the things is you look at our Fantasy Pros team that finished 108th, which 108th is not something that's going to jump out to anybody, but you and I were excited about that because there are a huge number of teams. So to finish 108th, you did quite well. On that team, we drafted Rashee Rice in round 3 and Stephon Diggs in round 4. And partly in your head, you're thinking, okay, well, if I just had an elite quarterback for one of those guys, then you'd be off to the races. That's not the way that it works. You don't know that Rashee Rice is going to go out. You don't know that Stephon Diggs is going to go out. The fact that you have Xavier Worthy and you have Ladd McConkey on that team, and they go ahead and they both do quite well to pull you through, and then they score in the fantasy playoffs to help you finish in the top 150.
And then, of course, that was a team where we had, Kittle and Bowers, and we had Bucky Irving in a flex spot, and we had some other good things going too.
So being able to structure a team so that you can have your top 2 receivers go out, do almost nothing for you, and still score well, that requires having a lot of good players and not necessarily having that elite QB. It's not something where you go back and say, oh, just put the elite QB in for whoever got hurt. You don't know who that's going to be when you go through the drafts. And, the team that I had that finished 71st in the main event had Jaden Daniels. He was very, very highly rostered for me, for us, for the Stealing Bananas community. That worked. And yet, even feeling like that was the very clear-cut, most obvious QB play, not just this year, but probably in a long time, right? When you consider what his profile was coming in. Even for that to hit, I still think that there is going to be some potential to take elite quarterbacks in 2025, especially if we get a running back ADP landscape that allows for a deeper overall top 10 rounds. I think that one of the things that you would know a lot more, actually, Ben, what the discussion is sort of within the community and globally than I would. But I do think that a really interesting part of running backs and having a lot of good running backs and having them potentially push down other players, actually, regardless of where they're drafted, if you have a lot of running backs scoring, then there are just more total points in the pool, and you're going to have more teams that score a lot, are competitive, have interesting lineups. That part makes fantasy football, I think, a lot more interesting. Frankly, in some of these seasons where everybody gets hurt and the teams that win are essentially the teams that stayed healthy, people will say, well, Shawn, a lot of what you do is based on that. I don't like it, though. I would love for everybody to stay healthy and we get to see who actually has drafted the best team.
The winning team in Underdog's BBM was a Jamar Chase team where Jamar Chase did not hit the lineup. The number 2 team was a Justin Jefferson team where Justin Jefferson did not hit the lineup. The number 3 team was an Amon-Ra St. Brown team where Amon-Ra St. Brown was the lowest scoring last flex spot and nearly got capped by George Kittle by less than a point. Kittle didn't hit the lineup. the first round picks on all the top 3 teams in the biggest contest over at Underdog were different first round picks. There wasn't like a specific path that you had to have or a guy you needed, or you, like you were saying, there's different types of builds. And those first round picks didn't even necessarily hit the lineups. And that doesn't mean that the first round picks didn't score in week 17, but there was points elsewhere. Like you're saying, guys stayed healthy. There weren't as many dead roster spots late in builds. And we did have the rookies receivers hitting late for best ball. I mentioned Pearsall earlier. Obviously we have Brian Thomas. We have so many of these guys. I want to circle back to the receiver thing, but a couple minor notes on your quarterback thing, because I thought that was really interesting. The Stroud thing, if Stroud plays like Burrow or like Goff or scores like them, we wouldn't care about his ADP. So the ADP thing is just not, I think, relevant to me. It gets back to your point of you just want to make good picks at every spot. And if Stroud had the Burrow season, he would have been worth that ADP. That's just the reality of it. And that's who we thought was going to have that season. That's why he was ranked ahead of Burrow. We all thought Burrow had potential for it as well. And we all thought Goff had potential as well, because Goff, for a guy who runs none, was still reasonably highly priced, right? Good offense and all of those things. Goff had, what did he have? He had 56 total rushing yards. Stroud had like 230, I think I just saw a minute ago, and Burrow was actually slightly lower than that, 215 or something. Again, so in terms of like, well, some people might be thinking, well, Burrow's actually a little bit more mobile than Stroud. Stroud had more rushing yards than him, and he had way fewer dropbacks because that team didn't pass as much. One of the big things with Burrow was he led the league in pass attempts, which again was part of the conversation with Stroud. So anyway, as far as player archetype goes, but you mentioned Jane Daniels' archetype was the one still that we're targeting, the mobility and the guy that we were really, really in on. As you said that and how clear of a play he was, I remembered how like we sort of had to tiptoe around the Daniels as a better play than Richardson, even if they're priced the same conversation all off season, because it is really hard to make those claims when there's a groupthink and there's an accepted element elsewhere. But you were clear about that from the early offseason. We talked about it a lot for months. The Daniels passing profile was meaningfully better than Richardson's. That's one of those examples of, look, we talked about we had things we were wrong on, like the Dalton Kincaid you brought up, right? But I want to point out, when there's those types of very intricate conversations that we have, like a long view, go back to college, talk about who these players are, talk about elements of their profile, the rushing stuff with them. I had a really strong take about Daniels rushing being more built into who he was because of his scramble rate in college relative to Richardson not scrambling as much, getting the ball out, but having a higher designed run rate, which they could actually scale back. And they did at times when he was playing. And then eventually after he came back, they ramped up the design run again. But it's more based on coach decision as opposed to player like feel and decision making on the field in terms of what their rushing elements could offer. That wasn't necessarily specific to why Daniels did better than Richardson, but I think you know that whole conversation I think is interesting to think back on as it relates to now that we have the results and we have Daniels looking as good as he did versus the way that Richardson looked, and some of the concerns that we had about Richardson coming in as it related to a profile that was very unclear and uncertain. And you can talk about just, you know, playing for ceiling in these things, but the player has to be good enough to hit the ceiling. And that was something that, I mean, now Richardson's getting thrown under the bus by his whole organization, his teammates, all of these. It's been a wild week for him. It seems like he may be getting like traded in the offseason. Like the Colts are ready to completely move on, sort of another Trey Lance situation, which is unfortunate. That's not what anybody wanted. But you're getting a lot of like effort and these things being questioned, which goes back to the tapping out we talked about in season. But there's been a lot more of that. You maybe have not seen a lot of this, but it's been going on.
I haven't. I think in some ways it's unfortunate, because I do think that I mean, I don't know what's going on there. There could be effort things, but so often it's just, if you don't want to admit that you drafted someone who was a terrible college player, which is what the college football analysts told people, then you're going to blame it on him instead of your own evaluation. I think that's a little bit dirty in terms of making that pick, even though the profile wasn't there, and then trying to extricate yourself from it and move blame into a different spot. That's unfortunate.
That's very unfortunate. It's a great point. One of the things, though, that you may not be as privy to, that is being brought up is specifically his work ethic and some of these things. You have veterans coming out and saying that they had conversations with him during the season that, one of them had a quote, or I think it was an anonymous source had a quote that was like, I re-signed here, because I believed in you, and basically like, will you try harder? Like there's been some stuff about like he wasn't showing up in meetings and some of those things, which you never, again, really know the full story on. But part of the reason I think he's catching the blame is that there's a lot of smoke around this. Maybe he isn't doing what a franchise quarterback should be doing. And maybe that's why the tapping out thing became a bigger deal and all of those things, that there was concerns about the way he was handling himself in meetings and preparation and all of that. Who knows? Right. He's still a very young
we had
player.
similar things with Kyler Murray, where the team is like, we decided to put video games into your contract. But I mean, in the end, Cliff Kingsbury gets fired. And I don't think that there's necessarily any genius there with him. And yet, I mean, he looks very different with Jaden Daniels. The Daniels thing, too, I do want to also mention as it comes back to our rookie conversation. And as it relates to Bowers, as it relates to Marvin Harrison, where do the rookies give you leverage and give you this immense upside that you can't otherwise get at the price simply because they're rookies? Right? Jaden Daniels' price never made any sense because he came in with such an extraordinary fantasy profile and was good. Now, even if he isn't nearly as good, that extraordinary fantasy profile is going to give you a lot. But when you get access to both things, the quarterback thing, and you mentioned if Stroud had scored, we wouldn't have been concerned about his price. I do think that's a good point. I also think it's kind of interesting as we think through sort of redraft versus best ball, where in best ball, when you have to have two, you have this QB window that we've talked about for a long time at RotoViz, and shows up really clearly in our roster construction explorers, the tools, that kind of thing.
And that's something
redraft
that show up in the top best ball teams. I noticed was the QB window was very successful again this year.
Redraft is interesting because you do sometimes just overall, but then it can be really exaggerated individual drafts where once the first 12 quarterbacks go, you can get such a fall that, CJ Stroud is going in, say, round 8, and the 14, 15, 16 types of guys can be going in rounds 14. That does move you out of a range where the round 8 player, certainly you can miss on round 8 players, but the round 8 player could do something very meaningful for you, whereas the round 14 player, I mean, you want to hit on some of those throughout your fantasy career. You want to hit on some of your 14 through 20 picks, but your 14 through 20 picks are more lottery types of selections.
Can't we just take Bucky Irving there in every team that we build forever?
Well, some people
I would like to have that
when we
player
decide to do it in
14th.
the 11th, then you have to pay more if you want to get him every time. But yeah, I mean,
that's right.
In theory, that's what you want to do.
I mean, in best ball, you're making a great point about best ball versus managed here, but in best ball, you could get Bucky in the 15th all offseason. You mentioned a little bit ago about having the discipline to not take the draft value on the players you really do like. And as you said that, I was like, yeah, that's a really sharp point, something that I want to be more aware of going forward. Also, I was saying Bucky Irving was like 3 or 4 rounds mispriced all offseason and just kept drafting him. And I had 6 percentage points more Bucky than any other player. I had like 37% of him and 31 of the next highest player. And I kind of am glad that I did that. If you identify the player correctly, that is just completely, but obviously it can also tank you when you do it with the Stroud type stuff like you were talking about. The receiver thing, the QB conversation is so interesting. I let myself get way off track, but I wanted to comment on the receiver thing because I think that's a really fascinating one. And you've been making this point a couple of different times in a couple of different ways as it relates to the cost as well, and why Brian Thomas and Ladd, for example, were very strong plays in hindsight is related to cost. I mean, again, you can make the case that I just made with Stroud for Brian Thomas, that if he was going much higher, he would still have been worth it because he scored awesome. He was the number one, scorer in the fantasy playoffs, etc. But the Marvin Harrison thing, we already saw last year where, okay, our rookie receiver price is too frothy. And Harrison, Rome Odunze is the other one I have to mention, even as a huge UW guy and a huge Rome Odunze fan, was the consensus big three third part of that, and everyone was saying, well, he's actually a huge discount in redraft because he's going way later than Harrison and Malik Neighbors. That's it was a common refrain. I shouldn't say everyone was saying that, but that was a common refrain that he was a discount back by Brian Thomas and that next year, and Xavier Worthy in that next year, that he was actually a value there. Well, he wound up at a pretty reasonable price, still not being a very strong pick, not having a particularly great season. Worthy for much of the year, not a bust, but was a lot of missed opportunities. There are other outcome, and then just generally, the 2024 rookie class has been incredible. I mean, I think the 2024 QB class is going to go down as something that reinvigorates the entire league and a lot of offenses around the league. And I'm so excited about the 2024 QB class. It's one of the biggest stories of the season for me. The running back class we knew was a little bit weaker and actually has not been particularly productive at the top. Obviously, Jonathan Brooks, really unfortunate thing where he doesn't play a lot of the year, then re-injures. We don't get much other production from the day two guys, Blake Corum, Trey Benson, Jalen Wright. Those guys didn't do much of anything. Was Jalen Wright day two or was he round four? I can't remember. Anyway, you get back into the deep guys, the Bucky and the Tyron Tracy, there was some production, but the running backs weren't necessarily great. The receivers were awesome. And I do think some of the response is going to be to push up rookies again. And I guess I just wanted to comment on that you made, I thought, a really strong point about the difference between pricing and the opportunities for the Bowers play and the Brian Thomas and Ladd plays, who we admittedly weren't as on as we should have been. The Jaden Daniels play, the Bucky Irving play in the late rounds, being able to play the late round running backs, the Tyron Tracy, how that panned out, the ways that those guys can hit.
Irving and Tracy had the best peripherals of the running backs in the class. And so it doesn't mean that they're going to hit, right? Those things are not in any way, shape, or form completely definitive. There are a lot of other things that go on as well, but you're looking for those opportunities where you have a strong reason to believe that talent is heavily discounted.
Yep. And again, the discount, the price, that element remains so key because as you were talking about with Harrison, he was someone we talked about as overpriced, someone we talked about as you mentioned at one point a little while ago when you're talking about the receivers, what the floor to ceiling combo was for a guy being drafted in the first 15 picks in some of the higher, more competitive, I guess, formats. I was going to say higher stakes or whatever you want to call it. He was an early second round pick in a lot of formats. I know in a lot of more like home leagues, he was maybe a later second or early third. But when you started talking about him going in the top 15 and, one of the things that I talked about this offseason was how Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, who were rookie hits, still weren't as good as they would go on to be. They both averaged at least 2.0 targets per game more in year two than year one. So like in terms of consolidating volume, even when you are a first round pick who comes in and is an unquestionable hit, you're not a 50 or 60 target guy necessarily. Puka Nacua was obviously in 2023. What we saw with Harrison was the other side of that equation was I was looking at the guys that were even when they were hits, but what if he's not even necessarily a clear hit, which he wasn't this year. But you mentioned the floor to ceiling thing. I just wanted to go back to that. As far as his pricing, that's the part that I think was always missed was the range. I mean, even if he did hit, could he hit in pure volume in a way that would be like his own personal prime? Because it's really hard to do in year one. Now, a Malik Neighbors season happened, a Brian Thomas season happened. I mean, those seasons can happen, but then also the floor side of it and how when that player really isn't having a good year, and if he's not good enough, I mean, Harrison was one of the more catastrophic picks you could make this year, unfortunately. But so the rookie conversation is deep and is complex is the point that I'm getting to is even though this was a year where we can't early returns on the 2025 class are that they're not as strong as 2024. We can't expect rookie classes to have as much production as we had in 2024. And even though it was that strong of a rookie class, it had the best tight end season of all time, this great, rejuvenating QB class, some great late round running back production, and some legitimately awesome wide receiver production at different price points. Despite all of that, you still have examples of the pitfalls. You still have the highest priced skill position player, in single QB leagues, the highest ADP of any rookie was a massive, colossal bust for redraft and for fantasy, and several other rookies throughout, including the Adunze pick, including if you were taking Jonathan Brooks in a lot of builds, which I was, and thought he might return and be really strong, and fading Chuba as part of that, which was something that, I thought he was going to be so good that Chuba wouldn't be able to have any late season production, and that became catastrophic. He needed to have some exposure to Chuba, and so there were still some mixed results in an unquestionably dominant rookie season. And I think that's an important element when we think about going forward, what it means. We should expect weaker overall production, and we should also be wary of the cautionary tales.
And being wary of the cautionary tales as well, like you just point out there, I think is important, because if you do have a prospect who it truly is generational, and it's possible that Marvin Harrison is, and that Kyler Murray is just that bad. The various numbers that I looked at from Sports Info Solutions, looking at how Malik Neighbors was successful, comparing that to the types of seasons that Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb had in college, thinking about a Brian Thomas almost certainly siphoning some volume from him, and now knowing what we know about Brian Thomas, you're like, well, I mean, that was probably a huge factor. It did look to me like he had a chance to be something like even more than special. He looked to be somebody who could be that Jamar Chase type of player. And right now, knowing what we know, knowing about the Brian Thomas season, which actually came in a good environment from the perspective of there weren't other targets as the season sort of developed. But I mean, you're catching passes from Trevor Lawrence playing really poorly, and then from Mac Jones. You're doing it in an offense coordinated by Doug Peterson, who seems pretty overmatched at this point. For him to do that, for Malik Neighbors to have the massive target games early in the year, to have that game with Drew Lock in week 17, where Neighbors is supposedly so hurt that the team doesn't want him to play. If you were to put Malik Neighbors,
talking about how good Drew Lock's stats were in that game, and the specific production was basically just snap the ball and throw it to Malik Neighbors, and then he would weave through the whole defense and score long touchdowns.
There are certainly worlds in which the Giants got just like borderline competent QB play and coordinating, where Malik Neighbors wouldn't have just been worth where Marvin Harrison was drafted, but would have been worth a mid-first round pick. Just like Brock Bowers was worth a mid-first round pick. I mean, you're going to get some of those seasons at some point going forward, but again, with the understanding that, I mean, this was a truly unique class in that it had so many superstars. I haven't had a chance to do the deep dive into 2025 yet, but it just, you don't have those guys in every class. I mean, you could have a very good class that doesn't have anybody who would have been a legitimate top 5 pick in this most recent class, and have it still be a fine class.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because, I mean, go back to when you wrote the series that like 6 different guys could be the Dynasty 101, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you said after the fact at one point that one of the guys you didn't write about was Malik Neighbors was part of that series. I was going to say, if I'm not mistaken, Malik Neighbors wasn't a part of that, but he was. There was somebody after the fact that you were saying maybe it was better than all of them, but wasn't a part of the series. I can't. Maybe it was you talking about Bo Nix at one point.
I might have been joking about him or Xavier Worthy. The one player that after the draft, and certainly early in training camp, where it didn't seem that positive. I was like, well, Drake May obviously doesn't belong. I definitely think now that we have all the information, he doesn't belong, because Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors and Brock Bowers were so good that, I mean, you would have to be a potential Hall of Famer, or and not like a potential, but one where after the rookie season, you're like, well, that guy's almost certainly going to be in the Hall of Fame if they don't get hurt, to belong with them. But even the one who was the most questionable from that group in May, if there's any way to sort of abstract out the New England portion of it, which was just horrific, both from a teammate caliber perspective and from a coaching perspective, I really think that the Patriots need to start over completely. And Drake May looked fantastic as well.
Yeah, he was great. Good overall season from that rookie class, as we were talking about. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Neighbors and Harrison distinction, and yeah, I mean those little nuances are going to be so interesting as we go forward. And then there's still the key elements of how do we how sure can we even be on a lot of these things, and how much uncertainty there is. All of this stuff feels so clear in hindsight when we just saw it happen, right? And then it feels like, oh, this is going to happen again next time. You got to remember how unclear it was in the offseason. Part of the reason that people were not as confident about Brock Bowers or what have you is that there's tricky elements. You're talking about the Brian Thomas situation where he's catching passes. One of the big things we talked about with Bowers in the offseason was basically, that we thought because Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell were both there that they could at least have some competent QB play. We did see when those guys both went out and Desmond Ridder played for a little bit that it was pretty tough for Brock Bowers at that point. Then he also benefits a little bit from Devonta Adams getting traded ultimately and some of those things. Of course, he was already hitting at that point and was going to be a clear hit, I think, regardless. But those types of team situations and those things, something you talked about last week, Bowers had a very strong schedule for production this year, and the schedule probably won't be as strong next year. And anyway, I don't know why Bowers popped in my head. I was just thinking as I was sort of crystallizing all of your thoughts there in my own mind, just about how, as we look back and we try to reflect on the things that happened, again, we don't want to overlearn those lessons from last year. We got to also remember what we were thinking coming in and the range of outcomes and where the player hit in that range of outcomes, because we have a tendency to look back and think that the thing that happened was always certain and was the only thing that could happen and was the 50th percentile. And then, they can grow from that or whatever. A lot of times it's like, nah, this hit like the 80th percentile for this player. Like when you were talking through Brian Thomas, you're talking about the situation wasn't great, but I was also thinking, yeah, he really got fed a lot of volume late. They started just throwing a lot of quick wide receiver screens. If he's in a more functional offense later that also has good teammates, what will that mean? Could he get pigeonholed into a little bit of a deep threat role or something? I don't think that's necessarily going to happen to him, but we'll see. I mean, I think there's some argument that part of his situation benefited his ceiling by just pumping him volume. And, maybe that's not something that will always be there if he's in a different type of offense in the future. I mean, there's all of these types of little elements that are important to consider. Like, why did Kyle Pitts have 1,000-yard season as a rookie and then do nothing the next 3 years? As I was talking about Brian Thomas with some people, I think off the shows and off the places, and kind of rehashing some of the things that I've said about, being low on him, because there really wasn't a lot of production until the third year, and it was mostly efficiency based and those things. I was like, I mean, you bake all that stuff in with draft capital, and you kind of have Kyle Pitts, right? Like, he was a 3-year guy who was massively good in his third year. Now, Thomas was better, 17 touchdowns in his last year. Pitts missed some games in his final year. The 3-year early declare with the draft capital, with the combine numbers, which both guys were very athletic. If you can tell me why you were in hindsight, and I both know that I missed on Brian Thomas, but also in hindsight, I'm like, if you can tell me why I should have been so certain about Brian Thomas, then I would ask how I could have been more certain that Kyle Pitts is not good at football. Because their profiles are at least parallel to each other. They're somewhat similar. And there's still a tricky element, I think, to all of it. You still have to be cost aware, because there are uncertain elements. There's not anything that's ever purely clear, or as clear as it feels when you look back on it. It always feels so clear. Hindsight's 50-50, Sean.
I always love that one. The The Pitts mention did leave me wanting to ask you if before the 2024 season, the only play that you were allowed to travel in a time machine and see was the Kyle Pitts strike from Michael Penix to tie that game. How comfortable would you have been with Kyle Pitts picks going into the year?
That's a fascinating question. You only get to see one play, but it's coming from the rookie QB. I mean, I would have assumed that things went wrong for Atlanta. I would have assumed that because one of the big things I talked about with Cousins in the offseason was he only got benched if they were so bad they were out of the playoff hunt and all these things. They're still in the playoff hunt. I mean, they're still going into week 18 with the potential. I think I would have assumed that they were like 4-12. Kirk Cousins never came back from the Achilles and things were pretty bad. But if I saw Pitt scoring a TD, I think I would have also assumed that he was getting a lot of volume and playing well. Yeah, I mean, I think I would have been very comfortable drafting Kyle Pitts. There's
He's a tough one
he's
because
an enigma.
even
Sure.
in that game where he obviously made some other plays as well. I mean, you watch this season, and it wasn't just that his legs didn't seem to work; it was that his arms didn't seem to work. And then on that touchdown, like that defender's all over him. It's like he actually used both arms. He had two arms. He had hands
Yeah.
at the end of it.
Use his body, use
They
his frame. You're like, this is a football player making a football play. Where's this been? He's a
We'll
total
see.
enigma.
We'll see.
Yeah, it's a wild one. Yeah, that's one that I don't know why I brought him up because as far as learning lessons, that's one that I'll never learn and I'll never understand. But yeah, it'll be fun, Sean. We got a lot more to talk about. We've mostly focused on the 2024 rookies today. I'm excited. I'm excited for, early ADP. I'm excited for the evolution of I'm excited for the offseason discussions. As we sort of think through what's going to happen in the future and then ultimately seeing, what does happen in 2025, 2026, the years to come. 2024 was reinvigorating to not, I don't want to say reinvigorated me. I think it was, as you were talking about with everyone scoring, it was reinvigorating to the fantasy football landscape. It was a very, very good year for this hobby that we do and the ability to analyze it and the ability to have meaningful conversations about it going forward. It's just exciting. I mean, it was a fun year. There was a little bit of, something for everyone kind of a thing, and that makes it more appealing to discuss going forward and to think about and to analyze. And so this has been one of my favorite conversations. I think we said that last week. I think, most of the conversations this offseason with you, we didn't really know what we were going to do a show on this week. We kind of got started. I think whatever intro I did doesn't necessarily describe the show particularly well. We talked through the rookies for an hour, and I'm sitting here going, I mean, I would love to, and I'm sure the listeners would love to hear another 3 hours. I'd love to talk with you about this for 3 more hours and just go through all the different positions and all the different, age groups and all the different stuff. And that's what we'll do, over the next few weeks and months. But yeah, what a fun season. And again, where it sets us up with the year 2 guys, a lot of the year 2s that did hit where they go into year 3. I mean, we talked about the running back position as being down for so long. And going into this year, I was talking about how there wasn't a lot of prime age players because you had the old ones and you had that group that didn't hit in that span that where like CEH was a first round pick and Najee Harris was a first round pick. I think it's 2020 to 2023 or something. There's really not a lot of production. Those guys should have been prime age going into 2024. And it's not 2023 anyway. But we got Bijan and we got Jahmyr Gibbs looking great. So like that, the more recent group that was going into their year 2 is now going to be going into their year 3, and they're good. Devon Achane scored really well again. That group's good. Breece Hall is really good. So we do have the young guys aging into their early prime, or really like their prime. The running back position's brutal. And then you have these older guys that scored, and they're going to potentially age out, but I mean, man, I don't want to bet against all of them or even any of them. I don't want to bet against Christian McCaffrey coming back and being able to score next year. He signed an extension last offseason. He's still planning to play. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, all of these dudes. Aaron Jones was just talking. I saw a headline that he wants to be back with Minnesota next year, and he's another one of these older guys that wasn't great all year necessarily, but is good and is in a good offense and could continue to succeed next year. You have even some of the maybe not highly skilled guys in they're in their younger 20s, the Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon. Those guys got huge volume, and they're going to be plays for some people, probably not for us particularly next year. But the running back position is reinvigorated, I think, in a major way. And then you're going to have, more guys coming in. I mean, Bucky is going to be a big part of the conversation going forward. Hopefully this rookie class has some more hits as well. Tyron Tracy looks like a clear one as well. I mean, he looks like he's going to be their starter next year, probably, depending on how their whole offseason goes. But anyway, there's so much of this. I think the running back position is reinvigorated overall. I think the rookies have reinvigorated all of the different positions. I think the overall number of offenses that are intriguing across the NFL has been reinvigorated in large part because of this QB class, this young QB class, and just some of the offensive trends that we saw. Scoring was back up. I think the kickoff stuff really helped that, but there were some other elements to it, that we've talked about a little bit on the show over the offseason or over the season. But teams have gotten a little bit better in the red zone, some of those types of things, better at finishing drives, better at scoring. The sport is I argued earlier in the offseason in the in-season shows that we did, that the sport is in a good position. People love to talk about how the product is so bad. And I was, I wrote about it in the Stealing Signals intro. I'm pretty sure we talked about it on the show. I feel like the product was way better this year than the last two seasons. Setting aside the fact that all of the scoring was good for the future of fantasy football, but just, the way that the sport was played was much better in 2024 than how low it had gotten in 2022 and 2023 with the defensive shifts and those things that we've been talking a lot about. So anyway, long soliloquy, I guess, but I'm excited. It's a fun thing to be thinking about right now. I don't think I've ever been this, I always feel burnt out. I don't think I've ever been this energized on January 3rd. I'm just raring to go.
Well, like we said, we're going to try and go out there and win the FFPC playoff contest. And if we are able to do that, we'll be even more invigorated for the offseason, Ben. But I wanted to leave you with a controversial question to get you in trouble. I mean, we want something for the listeners who are here at the 110 mark. Let's say you jump from today into August drafts. You do know that Saquon Barkley didn't go off in the reality playoffs. The Philadelphia Eagles maybe have a slightly disappointing exit. Nothing new there in terms of information. So basically what you're working with is a Saquon Barkley who averaged just under 17 expected points per game, added 6 fantasy points over expected. Really an almost identical season to Jonathan Taylor in 2021, where he became a controversial 101 selection in 2022, and in part because of injury, obviously, disappoints. But Taylor in 2021, again, approximately 17 expected points per game, a point less in terms of FPOE, 5 instead of 6. But again, that predicated on a huge number of breakaway touchdown runs, not a lot of receiving value in the EP numbers for either guy. You're in a draft. Jamar Chase has gone at the 101, as feels pretty inevitable once people actually work through everything. You're sitting there at the 102. Malik Neighbors is healthy. The Giants have a QB. Brock Bowers is healthy. The Raiders have a QB. Which one of those 3 guys are you taking at 102?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this is I think I was saying to you before we even got on, but a few weeks ago I wrote about how I was buying into Saquon and was buying into that I was going to be willing to take some Saquon Barkley in the top 5 next year, just sort of based on the ways he's accumulated points and all these things. But then all it really took was him not scoring. This is what I was telling you, is all it really took was him not scoring a bunch in the fantasy playoffs, which was something we'd kind of talked about could happen sort of all season. And suddenly I was, back on that. The way that I wrote it at Stealing Signals was, basically come slap me if I change my mind next season, because I want to make sure that I have some exposure to him. I mean, this 345 carries right now, presumably going to have several more in the postseason. It's going to go well over 400 touches. They're going to have a different, schedule. They're going to have a different, there's the potential for offensive line attrition and these types of things. He's going to be 28, 29, whatever it is. I don't know how you could take him over the young superstar receiving threats. So I think, it would have to be Neighbors or Bowers at this point. I mean, if you're talking about...
Did the Kenny Pickett sneak freak you out at all for his? Because you're always thinking, well, there are paths to where, on top of what he does from a yardage perspective, the Saquon Barkley scores 20 touchdowns. And you're talking about one of these players who is more up around 30 than where he currently is, where he currently is, if you were guaranteed to get that production, you would definitely take him.
Yeah.
But that's not the way that it works. This was kind of the conversation between McCaffrey, who was coming off injury, and Jonathan Taylor for 2022. And one of the things that I loved about Jonathan Taylor heading into 2022 was that everything that we knew about him at that point, the season he had just had, what he had done in college, the size speed combination, Jonathan Taylor was an absolute unicorn. And you could ignore some of the scoring context to take him. The thing that's always been tricky is just the guys at the very top have had the most abysmal, almost impossibly bad injury luck. So we can't even evaluate some of those claims that cleanly, not having seasons from those players. But it is interesting because you do get the impression sort of right now that Barkley is looked at differently. And
when you say
there
that,
are some reasons why he probably should be looked at as less than Taylor as opposed to more.
Yeah, there really is. And as you talk about, one of the reasons that Taylor going into that next year, I mean, he was young, but also you had more, I think, more receiving upside than we're going to have with Barkley. As you talk about the top running backs that have gotten hurt, I mean, one of the long-term trends that has been consistently very true throughout the history of fantasy, and this one's one of those ones that goes back like 20 years. I mean, LaDainian Tomlinson is like one of the only guys that ever really bucked this, is like the dude that has the awesome season the year prior that ends up going as the number one overall pick as the RB1 has often been a bust for like 20 years. It's really, really difficult, especially as a running back, to capture all of the things that you need to capture, which for Barkley, I mean, he can still be very good, but it includes a lot of long touchdown runs. That alone is a really hard thing to replicate. That's what we saw with the great Taylor season. And then he hasn't had another year like that since, where he's been able to rattle off so many long TD runs like Saquon had this year. But the other part of it is like you have defenses now suddenly like, okay, well, we're going to pay more attention to the run game. And, to stop the Eagles, we got to stop Saquon Barkley. And, which you would think during the season became a focal point of defenses, but maybe not so much when you have A.J. Brown and all these other elements. Maybe it wasn't something that and just with the way the Eagles were rolling in their offensive lines, blocking and healthy and all of these things, that it's really difficult to do it multiple years in a row. And a lot of that is injury related, as you've pointed out. It's been injury related with McCaffrey when he's been the 101 and failed and those things. But there's been players that have stayed reasonably healthy at the top and still not been hyper productive. Like Taylor's a good example. Or when he was healthy, he wasn't necessarily, because it's just hard to recapture the magic of that season, especially then you talk about coming off all of the work. And I do think the fact that he's going to be going into the postseason and getting even more touches, it's a lot, man. He's already set a career high in touches. He's going to be way up there for a guy who has had lower body injuries in the past and is approaching 30.
Well, and you can look at it a little bit the other direction too. I don't want to equate like a 3-game super hot stretch for Jonathan Taylor to what Barkley has done over the whole season, because what Barkley has done over the whole season is extraordinary. But if you just knew their playoff scores, you would be pretty startled to find out that Barkley had scored so many long touchdowns during the rest of the season that he had been a world breaker, and you would have been surprised to find out that Jonathan Taylor had had so few, and that otherwise the offense had been so poor that he wasn't even good until that
The
3-week stretch.
BBM champ drafted Jonathan Taylor 1 pick ahead of Saquon Barkley in his draft. And he went up $1.5 million over on Underdog.
Insane. I mean, you think about the ability to replicate the long runs and how it feels inevitable right up until they dry up. You think about what Devon Achane did as a rookie, and then you think about what he did this year. But the thing with Achane is that he had an out, and he had a ability to replace that scoring with something that is almost equivalently valuable, which is a huge number of receptions. It's always possible that a back who is a good receiver, or at least, I don't actually think that Barkley is a great receiving back, but he certainly is more comfortable with it than someone like a Jonathan Taylor or someone like an Adrian Peterson. You know, every year you would hear, oh, we're going to get Adrian Peterson the ball in space. And you're like, he just has no intuitive ability to catch the ball and run with it. I mean, Barkley had a monstrous rookie season as a receiver, because even though he's not a McCaffrey-esque type of receiving back, I mean, the intuitive ability to catch the ball and run, I mean, he certainly has. If you have that and you're a superstar, then it's certainly not impossible, but he is probably in the worst possible place.
Right.
The Eagles have just been so fascinating because it's the best place in the entire NFL for generating the long runs. When you have those other threats and you have the elite offensive line, it's arguably the worst place in the entire NFL for creating high value touches. It'll be interesting to track because what he has done this season has been truly
That
the other little thing too is just that Barkley actually has had a lot of really bad runs still, which is something else that if you're going to replace the explosive runs and not have it replaced with receiving or short yardage touchdowns, you would need to replace it with fewer bad runs. The numbers don't really suggest that that's likely. That was one of the reasons that we had some skepticism about him coming in, because a lot of the bad runs were certainly there with the Giants, which is a different context. But you look at Barkley versus somebody like a Bucky Irving, and Bucky has far fewer of those bad runs. I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs has far fewer of the bad runs. Again, if he's the focus of the defense, it's going to be hard to replace those runs with different types of plays.
Yeah, and I mean, as you were talking through it being the best situation for the long runs and the worst situation for the high value touches, I was thinking about how there's definitely going to be an analysis out there that says he still has meat on the bone in the passing game, stuff like that. You just can't do that. I mean, you can't look at the way he scored in 2024 and say, well, I'm going to keep all of the rushing stuff and then talk about how he could score more in the passing game, because those two things are interrelated. I think if you told me that they wanted to try to throw to him more intentionally and they didn't want to rack up as many touches in the rushing game for him, I would be less interested in drafting him. I mean, to some degree, I guess the way that I'm thinking through it in terms of the trade-off of those touches, obviously the receptions are more valuable, obviously the high value touch stuff, etc. But he was so good. He averaged 125 rushing yards per game because of that commitment to running the ball that led to so many huge plays. How many 50-plus yard touchdown runs did he have this year? I mean, an absurd number. That's going to be the stat you look at and you go, well, he had 8 of those or whatever it is. Can you have 8 50-yard touchdown runs again? Because that's 10 points every time he does it. I mean, that's how many points did he score on 50-plus yard runs? Because I bet you it's close to 100 of his fantasy points was just that. And I mean, if I'm drafting Barkley again, I want him to be in the same exact situation. I want him to be running and scoring the way that he was running and scoring. I want him to have the potential to run for 2,000 yards again. I'm almost not worried about the receiving. And I certainly don't want to be drafting him because I think he can do what he did as a runner and then add to that. That's gonna be flawed logic.
Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking that there were paths for him to be a big touchdown scorer until I saw that Pickett sneak. Again, that shouldn't be something that overwhelms your entire view of the chaos of a season, the way a team. I think that it's important to understand how teams do things, but we can sometimes overstate their inability to change if evolving would make sense. I mean, we're always trying to get better at fantasy. Why wouldn't NFL coaches at some point be like, you know what we should do? We should let Saquon Barkley run around on the most important part of the field as well. I've mentioned it a little bit as it relates to how the Lions at different points in Barry Sanders' career would make some odd decisions with him. But yeah, the context doesn't seem great. And it is something where I think that celebrating the season he's had, which is one of the all-time great seasons, is the way to approach it. You can't go back and draft him at the 1-2 turn and benefit from having a guy at the end of round one who ends up being the fantasy MVP. You've got to evaluate it for 2025 at the price that it's going to be, which is the 101, the 102, the 103.
Yeah. And the opportunity cost, which is, as you posed it to me, that got us going on this whole Saquon conversation. Some really fun, young, good players that we're going to want to have exposure to. So it's going to be a tricky bet for sure.
Chase Brown, Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy, Chuba Hubbard, names that allowed zero RB builds to be competitive in an environment where veteran and context specific running backs A, stayed healthy, B, scored a lot of points. It'll be fascinating to see how ADP shifts, because certainly a shift back in the direction of early running backs, especially backs who have fit the historical dead zone profile, should open up even more opportunities. Can't wait to see what 2025 will be like. As you mentioned, we'll have much more content on this as we go forward. Good luck to everybody who is participating in week 18 contests. Good luck to everyone as you're rooting for your favorite reality teams it's probably just a handful of fans who want to see either the Lions or the Vikings get the number one seed, but certainly there are a few AFC fans out there who want to have their guys clinch the final AFC playoff spot. Good luck to everyone there. As we mentioned, excited for the FFPC playoff contest. We'll have a lot of content on that next week. Hope you all had the perfect Monday night finish and the perfect week 17. Got all your leagues and titles in there. Ben, that'll do it for this episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always has been Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. Make sure you're always checking out Ben's betting content, and well, that is fantastic. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Leave us a rating and review. That helps us so much with the algorithm. We love you guys. Talk to you soon.